Greetings, citizen. Welcome to the show, and thank you for listening. For more of the art of wargaming in your life, definitely check us out on Instagram and Facebook. If you'd like to support the show, we have a Patreon account where you can do just that for as little as $1 a month. What we can offer will expand as the show does. If you don't have extra funds but would still like to help us out, you can give us a like, share, or 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. Want to get in touch? Feel free to message us or hit up our email, artofwargamingpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you because we know the world is vast, with many different ideas on tactics and strategy that can be applied to the games we enjoy.
You're listening to the Art of Wargaming on the Ear Firm Network.
On War.
Welcome to the Art of Wargaming on the Earworm Network. I am Malark. As you've probably noticed, the schedule continues to be rocky. I continue to want to bring you quality content, and I will continue to do so. Eventually, we're going to be able to get back to our old schedule, but as of right now, I still am experiencing a degree of uncertainty. So, I appreciate you bearing with me. I appreciate you sticking around and continuing to listen. It enriches me, and hopefully this enriches you. So let's start talking here for a second. Like I said, we got a rocky recording schedule at the moment. Hopefully getting back to our 2-a-month gig, but we will see. October is kind of the anniversary area, so maybe by then we can get our act together. But no, I know I talk a lot about that, but I don't often talk about personal stuff on this show. I like to talk about games, and I like to talk about, analysis and stuff, but I don't usually talk about me. And part of the reason that the recordings have been so rocky is that I've been having some health issues. I don't really want to go into exactly what it is, but I've been having a lot of doctor's appointments, having to travel long distances to get diagnostics done, getting poked, prodded, shocked, bent, everything. So, what that means is a rocky recording schedule because a rocky research schedule. I need to be able to have the time to sit down and do my work without being foggy from medications or whatever. So part of the reason that I have become so inconsistent is because I have been suffering from some of these health issues. But we've had good news. We've got a diagnosis. We've got a way to move forward. So things are looking up for the future of my recording schedule. And I am... I'm looking forward to being able to be more consistent, is the hope. As you heard in the last episode, I was unable to go to Chaos Wars, and that only, at the time of this recording, it's only just gotten done, and I'm still getting some of the debriefs from people. From what I understand, it was very busy, a lot going on, and one of the things, for better or for worse, that's been happening in a lot of events is that you start to have a far more rigorous schedule. There's a lot more classes and panels and discussions and other things along that nature that to me seem more like a sci-fi fantasy convention than an actual event, because when I was a young man, there might be 1 or 2 classes that were held by certain people, and trials were certainly like if there was a big night trial or something, people would go to it. But as a general rule, mostly it was fighting or hanging out in our camp. But now, if you're paying attention to the schedule, you can fill your day up without hitting the field at all. And I totally get that that's bringing in non-coms. Like, it gives a place for people who are not combatants to go and to enjoy themselves. And so we're able to grow our community by incorporating more people. But it also means that it takes away from certain things, that a lot of things get overlooked or forgotten. So that's my only big issue with it. And again, I enjoy the fact that it's bringing enjoyment to people who are not necessarily fighters, and that is useful as well. But back in my day, it was either the field or camp, and so there was a lot more. It was different. And not bad, not worse, or not bad, not better, just different. But I think I've yammered for quite enough time. You didn't come here to hear me talk about me. You came here to hear about these particular topics. And so let's get into this episode where we're going to discuss actions against a flank. When we talk about flanking, it falls into two different categories. First, we have strategic flanking, and second, we have tactical flanking. The one that most of us are going to experience with our wargaming, whether it be like a tabletop sort of thing or a physical sort of thing, is the tactical. That's the sort of flank that, because it's all right there in front of us, we can see it. Now, if you play a game like Civilization, something where you have a much larger map and you have forces that are moving across large areas, that is a place where you can start to get a strategic flank. And now they are opposite things. Like they are mutually exclusive, or they can also be together. It's kind of Clausewitz kind of defines it loosely. And so oftentimes the strategic flank becomes a tactical one, but it doesn't necessarily follow the other. And so, of course, with the strategic flank, we're trying to get around, we're trying to threaten our opponent, and that might make the opponent turn and face us, face to face. There might be a relief force that comes in to face us face to face. And so the strategic flank can very easily become a normal battle, whereas a tactical flank is something that is used all the time in terms of whether or not you're doing it on the tabletop or whether you're doing it on the field. Now, I finally get to pick a fight with a dead guy. I know that I haven't used my catchphrase in like a year, probably over a year, because most of what Clausewitz says, I'm totally in agreement with. But in this particular part, I'm going to pick a fight with him. And it's going to be based on the different types that we're doing, like the different zones that we're covering. Because in his time, the exact quote from the book is that flanking belongs to the useless pageantry of theory, seldom met with an actual war. Not a fan of flanking, our old Clausewitz. He was very much not. And so the point here is that because flanking can be anticipated, anybody's looking out for it. Any general who's read X, Y, or Z book about, or tactical manual, everybody knows about flanking. Everybody knows that it gives you a massive tactical advantage, and so most people prepare for it. So you're not going to find a force that is unprepared for a flank, and that is the worst thing to do when flanking, is to send it against a prepared force. And so when we're dealing with Clausewitz's time, we're dealing with larger forces that are entrenched, either actual trenches or using some sort of barrier there to break up the field. And that makes it risky. That makes it really risky to be going in because, once again, we have to understand that at this particular time, artillery is king. And so when one goes against that flank, you're going to be exposing yourself to the artillery barrage and going out on your own. So his war is very difficult, or very different than ours, because in something like Belagarth, what I'm in, flanking is extremely effective. If you can get up there and turn the flank, you can roll right down the line. And even though people know about it, even though you can prep for it, because typically we're using small unit tactics, it still works extremely well. Now, when we start to get on the larger fields, where you have a big force, it can be difficult to turn the flank. But if you hit it with enough power, because artillery is not king for us, like we have archers. Don't get me wrong, those archers can be absolutely vicious. But when it comes to the sheer brutal capacity that artillery has, archers are just not the same thing. And so that kind of motion against the flank can absolutely be effective in what we're doing. Now, this concept might be able to apply to Warhammer 40k, because if you're going against certain armies, they might be able to prep themselves against a flank attack, or against any sort of a deep strike, which is to say coming onto the board from outside of it. A good example of this is when I play my Imperial Knights or my Chaos Knights. They are very good at covering the board. They are very good at moving and creating just a zone of protection that my opponent is going to have a hard time getting into. And so in this way, I am anticipating my opponent using flanking tactics and often leaving a space open. Like, oops, look in my back line, there's an area just large enough for a unit. And then when the people go back there in order to use it, I have actually craftily made this plan to take out whatever unit is there. So I get that in this particular one, but when we're talking about something like Belagarth or the SCA, it's not going to be the same. He's not correct when it comes to that. But when it succeeds, it's to great effect, regardless of whether or not it was during his time or our time. A successful flanking maneuver can really seal the fate of whoever we're going up against. So, pick a fight with a dead guy somewhat. When it comes to larger stuff, or to a 40k in certain armies in stuff like 40k, yes, I can see the argument that he might be right with this. But when it comes to something like Belagarth or the SCA, absolutely not. I'm a huge proponent of trying to go against that flank. But one of his big criticisms of it, and this is something absolutely to consider, is that your forces need to be divided to do so. Now, one of the big things that he stresses in his theory of war is don't divide your forces. That allows your opponent to take their main force against half of your force and then the other half, because they're no longer together. And so, that is a huge part of this, is to make sure, because when you're talking about the lines that they have, taking away bodies, taking away force from that line, it can be bad. It can create an area where the enemy can break through. And so at that point, the enemy is defeating us piecemeal. And that's not good. And so when we're going to use a flanking maneuver, even in something like Belagarth, even in something like a physical war game, we do need to be wise and recognize that when we do so, we are dividing our force. And that if the enemy is quick and can react properly, they can take us apart piecemeal. So it is important to be aware of that when we are trying to do it. Now let's talk about strategic flanking for a moment. Now, strategic flanking is when we're going to maneuver a larger force, or even a semi-larger force, into an advantageous position against our enemy. And so when we're doing strategic flanking, we're often trying to accomplish one of two operations. The first one would be action against the lines of communication, and the second one would be actions against the lines of retreat. Now, when we talk about the actions against the lines of communications, we're talking about all sorts of stuff. We're talking about attacking convoys, going after small resource detachments like work crews. Couriers and travelers are a great source of intel. They are a great source of material and whatnot. Small depots, areas that are used to store the necessary material for waging war. And, any sort of means of keeping the army vigorous or healthy. So if there's a link to some sort of dispensary for grain or for anything else, that medicine, something along those lines. Whatever it is, we're trying to disrupt our opponent. We're trying to disrupt their ability to take care of themselves, and we're trying to weaken them. It's not so much that we're trying to cut them off or cause them to move in some sort of forceful way. We're trying to hit this line and do so in such a way that weakens the army and lessens its combat potential so that it has to withdraw. It's just a matter of being like, we don't have the stuff. Our stuff is being choked back there, and so the army is then forced to withdraw. Now, the actions against the lines of retreat are very similar. You're still going after the same idea, but with the idea of threatening that line of retreat. Go after a convoy or go after a depot whenever you can. That's just smart to limit the opponent's access to material. But in this particular case, you're looking at it going, okay, how can I disrupt my opponent's plan of getting back? And so that's the point of that particular strategic flank is, it's easy. We're just trying to hit their line of retreat. So if we're going to flank, if our idea here is to pursue this, there are a couple of principles for the flanking. One of them is to use insignificant numbers as to not deter from the front. This is an important idea because, again, that front is important. We can't let it weaken to such a point that we can create a breach, because if they get in, they get to the artillery, they fold us up. It's not very good. So that's the first one, is to make sure that we are using insignificant numbers when it comes to the overall force, so it doesn't detract from the front. And then the second one is the enemy army is spent and cannot mount a fresh attack. So at this point, flanking further defeats our opponent. If they're sitting there and they're like, they've been fighting forever, they haven't had reserves, we've been pounding the bejesus out of them with artillery. At that point, going in and flanking, they are less able to take advantage of an opportunity of lessened forces in the front, and now have to deal with forces that are on the flank. And so not being able to mount that fresh attack means that they cannot engage us 2-to-1. Basically, if one army is 2 and the other army is 2, and we split our army into 1 and 1, the danger, of course, before is them going 2-to-1, 2-to-1. But in this case, if they can't mount that fresh attack, we don't have to worry about it. We're able to go in and kind of do a mop-up situation. So these two situations are different. They're not going to exist together. One of them is the use of insignificant numbers, and the other one is the enemy army is spent. And so if we have either of these, it's great. If we get both of them, that's fantastic, because that means that we are able to threaten our opponent without being threatened. We are able to move forward and use our numbers to the best advantage that we can without diminishing them too much. And again, when we're analyzing Clausewitz, we have to remember the time and the place in which he was writing, and the material and the weapons that were extremely effective. Another thing that we consider about flanking is often it's a cavalry thing. In Belagarth, it's your fastest runners. In something like 40K, you have fast attack units that are designed to get out there and get those angles. But these units are often weak, in at least in 40K. And while in Belagarth everybody is the same, it's good to note that in this particular case, when Clausewitz is talking about flanking or about sending forces out, he's typically talking about cavalry. And in previous episodes, I know it's been a while, we had talked about how cavalry during this time was very limited in its use. It wasn't out there engaging in normal battle because it wasn't very useful in the normal battle. It could get cut down very easily. It was probably it's the weakest. Great for pursuit. Fantastic for pursuit. If you recall the pursuit episode, that's like the whole reason that cavalry exists during this time, is to go, okay, the enemy's breaking, let's go break them further. And so this idea of dividing forces, this idea of trying to use a fast attack in one way or another, is just completely adverse to this style or to this theory of warfare. So it's important to remember that. As we're going through and we're starting to do a deeper analysis of some of these things, it's important to remember that, again, Clausewitz was talking about a different time. Now, we got to a point in the chapter, and anybody who's reading along at home will understand when I say that there's some complicated geometry stuff that is hard to understand without a whiteboard. Like if I was standing in front of you right now and I had a whiteboard, I could probably explain the different geometry when he's talking about, parallel lines and perpendicular lines and everything in between. Like he's got little diagrams in the book to try to explain this. And so sitting here talking to you right now, I'm just going to confuse you. So the idea, of course, is to hit the right geometry, is to hit the line at such an angle that it begins to fold. Now, within Belagarth, that can mean running all the way around. That can mean hitting it at an oblique. So an oblique is an angle where you're coming at it and it's not perpendicular and it's not parallel, it's kind of in between. And the idea is to just use it to fold up that line, just fold it up. But it's coming up at an angle compared to the other line. So when we're talking about this time frame, let's again kind of focus on that. Part of the reason that flanking attempts are discouraged here, even though we're sitting here thinking, well, they might be effective, even in the same way, if you know where your opponent's at, you can get there and get around and be tricksy and whatnot. But we're forgetting the fact that in most warfare, when you're dealing with a theater of war, we're also dealing with the fog of war. The benefit that we get when we're on the field doing physical wargaming or looking at the table doing our intellectual wargaming is that we know exactly where our opponent is. Unless we're playing something like Battleship, there's not a whole lot that we can do to accurately depict how messed up that makes communications. Again, we don't know exactly where our opponent is if we're fighting an actual war. In the current day and age, with the use of satellite imagery and drones, it's pretty easy. Like this day and age, it's a little bit more like the wargaming that we do because the knowledge of where the enemy is far easier to get. Also, the enemy snitches. Everybody snitches. You got soldiers on both sides taking selfies and whatnot in various zones, and you gotta know that the other people on the other side are looking for that stuff. And so The armies are snitching on themselves. You got electronic surveillance all over the place. And the light has been shown kind of breaking this fog a little bit. But again, at Clausewitz's time, there was no such technology. And so when you were moving around in the countryside, it was blindly, for the most part. So a flanking maneuver could be very, very, very dangerous because you could be moving against the main body of the army and not even know it. But again, with the flanking, you are known before the full force of the enemy is known, typically. A good example of this would be Custer's last stand. Here in Montana, you had the U.S. General Custer, who was a hero from the Civil War, who was out there and he was conducting operations against the tribes. And when he encountered what he considered just a settlement, he split his forces, and the one main force hit it and like straight on, and the other force was going around flanking to do what he had done in most of his other campaigns or battles, which was to threaten the main village, which is to say the elderly, the women and the children, and cause the braves to stand down because they didn't want the tribe to be slaughtered. In this particular case, the Sioux Nation, the whole of the Sioux Nation for the most part, came down upon him. Because not only were they ready, but he did not see. The fog of war here, like if you've ever been to eastern Montana or the West Dakotas or Wyoming, you know that the land, it kind of undulates. It's very much an up and down sort of thing. There's a lot of valleys. There's a lot of areas where something could hide even without trying. That creates a nasty fog of war in this particular area. So that was what he was encountering. Again, Custer didn't have aerial surveillance. He didn't know what he was going up against. And so his flanking maneuver split his forces. Now, could he have won the battle otherwise? Well, we're not here to theorize about that right now. But the point of the matter is that's demonstrating exactly what Clausewitz is talking about in this particular section, where you have that fog that disrupts. And so, again, according to his theory, according to the wars that he's waging, keeping that force together and maybe using a division system where you're splitting up into autonomous sections that are designed to support one another. But that was something that was developed in France for the most part, was used to great effect, and then was kind of carried on forth. And then you see in stuff like the American Civil War, it's a well-honored and practiced battle tactic. But at this time, it was still relatively new when it was being used on the larger scale. So Clausewitz says, keep your troops together, make sure that they're all working together, and then they work much better in terms of their efficacy. So take it with a grain of salt. Understand that, again, he was coming from his time, he was coming from his point of view, but still some of this stuff can be useful. And the fog of war is one of those. Now, in larger events, I have been to an event, I think I'd mentioned it forever ago, where we were in the forest. And it was also a mountainous, or a hilly sort of area, and it was thick forest, too. If you've ever been to the east of America, we can get pretty thick out there, a lot of vegetation. And so in that particular case, it could be somewhat difficult to nail down exactly where the opponent is. And I absolutely walked into a couple of places where I was like, there's a few people down there, I'll be able to engage them, and my friends will come help. Hello, there's an entire battalion, so to speak, kind of waiting for you down there. And so it can exist in certain game types, on certain fields, but for the most part with Belagarth, it's taking place on a small field, relative. I mean, to like the fields that we're talking about here, and it's fairly open. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, we don't want the hazards of somebody slamming into a tree, or getting their ankle twisted going down a little bit of a hill or into a gopher pit. And so there's a reason that we select it that way, but it also doesn't give us this particular challenge. Yeah, so that's kind of the idea there on the fog of war. So let's talk about actions against a flank. When are they the most useful? Like when are we looking to actually use this? We've got our principles for flanking, which is to say using the insignificant numbers and waiting until the enemy army is spent and cannot make a fresh attack. So what are we looking at? In the defensive is a really good one. Now, why do we say that? You'd think that it would be the attacker that would have the advantage here, but instead, the defender is far better aware of what the attacker's capabilities are and where they're at, simply because of the engagement. And so at that point, you can do what's called a sortie and send out a smaller force to disrupt or anything. You're not, in his time, you weren't trying to crush the enemy army with this particular maneuver. It was just a matter of disruption. And so in the defensive, this is extremely useful. Toward the end of the campaign is also a good time because we're wrapping up our operations here. And I'm assuming when he says toward the end of the campaign, he's meaning a successful campaign. And so at that point, using flanking maneuvers against inferior and spent armies isn't such a bad idea. That's not a bad idea either. And then when we're retreating into the heart of the country, if we're moving from a frontier region, and this matters. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about a more defensive war. When we retreat into the heart of the interior, we're talking about our interior, not the enemy's interior. That's the exact opposite concept with what we're dealing with. But we're retreating into the heart of our own country, which means that we are currently fighting in some sort of frontier region. And this topic is actually going to be the one that we discuss next episode, this idea of the retreat into the interior, or a fighting retreat, if you will. So let's do a little review real quick. There's a difference between strategic and tactical flanking. And while they do not necessarily feed one into the other, a strategic flank often becomes a tactical one because you're coming in at an angle. And if you're hitting with two different forces at the same time, it can be really difficult to deal with. We picked a fight with a dead guy and made our point that there's a lot of cases, in wargaming anyways, where the flank is amazing, where we want to go against the flank and turn it and have ourselves a good time by winning the game. But that is us dealing with a totally different set of rules, a totally different battlefield situation, a totally different relationship with the fog of war. So, this particular section is, I picked a fight for sure. We also were talking about how to do it in a good way. This idea of making sure that we're not allowing our enemy to take us apart piecemeal. We're not allowing our enemy to wolfpack us, as it were. So it's a special mind to pay to forces not diverted from the front. When we're talking about strategic flankings, we're talking about attacks against the line of communication or the line of retreat, both of which look extremely similar, but the attacks against the line of retreat are aimed at dislodging our opponent because they become scared and tenuous in their position where they're at. We then look at our principles for flanking, which is to say the use of insignificant numbers so that we're not detracting from the front, and we're looking for an enemy army that is spent and cannot make a fresh attack, remembering that in this particular time it was very, very, very risky. And tapping into that next idea of the fog of war, it was very, very risky to divide your forces and to engage the enemy in this way. And so doing so smartly. And even here we can draw inspiration from this. When we talk about an enemy army that is spent and cannot mount a fresh attack, we can also be talking about an enemy army that is actively engaged. Where the front is actively engaged, they are not paying attention necessarily to the flanks. And at this point, it's a great time to do it. When the battle starts and everybody can see everybody, trying to go into a flanking maneuver can backfire massively because people can become prepared for it. Much like he was talking about at the beginning, where it's like, why would you even bother flanking? Because your opponent knows, everybody prepares for it. Well, if we wait for the opponent to be engaged, if we wait for them to not have reserves, which happens a lot with something like Belagarth, everybody wants to be in the line, everybody wants to be a part of the motion, and so the archers are focused forward, everybody's come up and engaged, and so a flanking maneuver is often very effective because we don't have forces that are dedicated to be anti-flankers. It's just the way of it. And could we do that? Could there be a unit or a side that finally decides to kick that particular crutch and have somebody that is specially there? I know that I've served that before. Sometimes unintentionally, but just kind of hanging back, watching, seeing where the need is, and then being like, oh crap, here's some people coming in to flank. I'm going to make noise, make sure that my team knows that these folks are coming by, and counteract that the best that I can. So if you are a fighter in Belegarth, consider hanging back. Consider being a counter-flanker, not in the terms of relaxing or chilling out, but as the reserves that we had talked about before, ready to respond where needed, because, well, that's what these guys had. We had talked about the complicated geometry that I didn't want to go into, this idea of the fog of war, which is a term that was coined by Clausewitz, and that I very much like. We had talked about the example of Custer and his ignorance of who he was going up against and how the fog of war led to his demise. And then we talked about these actions against a flank and how they're very useful when we're in the defensive. So we're trying to turn our opponent or keep them from bringing their full force to bear. Toward the end of a campaign, when we're trying to do a wrap-up or when we're trying to pin our enemy in such a way that we can call them to battle if they're trying to get away from us. And then, of course, when we're retreating into the heart of the country. So I think we've discussed flanking in terms of how Clausewitz thinks about it. And I think that it is now time to say goodbye for this episode. And next time, we'll be talking about retreating into the heart of the country.
That's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't had enough of the art of wargaming in your life, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram, where I occasionally post funny and educational memes. If you want to get in touch with the show directly, you can email us at artofwargamingpodcast@gmail.com with any questions, comments, or concerns that you might have. Also be sure to check out all of our sister shows on the Earworm Network, including General Nerdery, Word Balloons, Fried Squirms, and more. We're working hard on having something for everyone. And again, you can find those at earworm.com. That's EARVVYRM. You can also find that in the show notes. But for now, this has been Yaga Malark, signing off.